you've done extensive work on fisheries in Uganda and more recently in Mozambique. How would you describe the state of fisheries on the continent based on the research you've done?
I think the first thing to understand is that African fisheries, especially coastal fisheries, have been under severe pressure for a number of decades, really, since the 60s, 70s, when you had large commercial foreign trawlers moving into African waters. And part of the problem was that these African states, either due to political instability or a lack of resources, they weren't able to effectively patrol their coastlines. So had large, intense fishing pressure, often illegal fishing practices, and a severe depletion of stocks. But you find this in the inland waters as well, in the nearshore coastal waters, which traditionally is the realm of small-scale fishers, artisanal fishing. And there the problem is slightly different. You do have often large increase of populations along the coastlines, much more people fishing, local people, and also improvements in boating technology, the use of outboard motors, new nets, nylon fishing lines, long lines, even in the small-scale fisheries sector. So this change in technology and these demographic changes have meant that fishing stocks generally have been in trouble, and in many cases still are in trouble. At the same time, I think it's important to emphasize that African fisheries and fisheries management in generally, it's not a lost cause. There have been successes. We do have examples, international examples, and in Africa where states have developed mechanisms through which they can govern fisheries and address issues like illegal fisheries, better management of small-scale fisheries. And that management often takes the form of supporting traditional practices, because we should also remember that the use of resources, whether they're forestry resources, fisheries resources, there have often been customary systems that have developed over time about what kind of gear we use, not fishing in breeding seasons, avoiding certain areas. And you'd find with the emergence of commercial fisheries, sometimes those practices were lost and now need to re-emerge.
As you just said, fisheries in Africa really happens at a local or subsistence level. Tell us a little bit about some of the things you witnessed during your field research.
On the subsistence level, it's actually really interesting. Uganda is a very interesting system. Of course, most of the fishing happens around Lake Victoria, or at least that's where my research was focused. And there you've got also Kenya and Tanzania bordering on Lake Victoria. So it's a shared resource. And what's interesting there is a lot of the subsistence fisheries or small-scale fisheries is focused on the tilapia fishery, but you've got a Nile perch fishery, which is actually quite advanced. The fisheries officials decided that they wouldn't allow commercial kind of trawling or long-line practices, so all the fishing is done on a small-scale artisanal level, off wooden canoes and very basic craft, but then goes to shore, is processed and in fact exported to Europe. So here you have a kind of a basic, almost subsistence style fishery, but that is linked to global supply chains, which is really interesting.
And in Mozambique?
Well, in Mozambique, you do have quite a strong distinction between a commercial fishery, which is very much focused on lionfish, but primarily prawn. And then you've got a very extended, all along the coastline, small-scale subsistence fisheries. Not always subsistence, because subsistence we often think of literally just catching some fish for the pot or for your family. But these are commercial activities often, and I think it's important when governing small-scale fisheries that one's got to be aware of those nuances. What we think of, or what may appear to us as pretty basic fisheries, often occurs in a rather complex social and economic system. So how you govern that system may differ in terms of people going out and linking to, in Uganda, for example, much of the subsistence fishing, you find those fish being transported by truck to places like the Eastern DRC, to South Sudan. So these are quite complex networks, and we need to think about the implications of that for governance.
So what are some of the priorities to better manage the continent's fishing resources?
Well, I think particularly with small-scale fisheries, there's been a big move in recent years towards involving fishers themselves and encouraging local organization to support governance activities, so to work hand in hand with fisheries inspectors trying to deal with illegal fisheries, for example, or have local fishers also gather the data so that one has a good idea of the kind of catch levels that are taking place at village level. And that whole approach is called co-management. And you have various co-management structures.
For example?
In Mozambique, they're called community fisheries councils. And these structures, I think, there's been a bit of ambivalence towards them. They really are critical because you can't have a handful of fisheries officials managing thousands and thousands of small-scale fisheries dispersed in small villages or landing sites all along the coastline or all along the lakeshore. It just can't happen. You have to have the fisheries involved. But at the same time, I think often this has been something that has been developed, and we find the structures exist, but they're in a bit of a limbo. They need better support. They need to be able to work more effectively with fisheries officials. Fisheries officials also need to understand that they're not handing over governance responsibility. It really is a partnership. It's a two-way street. So I think there needs to be a focus on how one can sustainably finance the activities of these community or fisheries organizations, so that they can do patrols, so that they can carry out activities, and really establish that relationship that you need. Traveling in Mozambique, we found there's quite a difference at the larger commercial sectors. These community fisheries councils would be operating quite efficiently, and they collect fishing permits, they monitor catches, all these activities. As you start moving away from the large population centers, you find they're more and more isolated, less activities, far less engagement with fisheries officials. And you really, really need that support. In Mozambique, we found, for example, it's become a problem. Fishing with nets in estuaries, or any fishing actually in estuaries, is not legal. It's a very important breeding area for the fish that are targeted both by the commercial and by the small-scale sector. But we found increasingly in the past few years that illegal fishing is taking place there. And again, the fisheries officials and inspectors, they don't have the capacity to check every estuary on the Mozambique coastline. It's not going to happen. They need to have the trust and cooperation of those local fishers, so that where illegal fishing is taking place, it can be brought to the attention of the officials, and then through a joint action, one can actually start addressing these problems.
Alex, thank you for talking to us.